Alright, so this episode was not very entertaining. Let's see if I can do better. We open up with Arondir after he's been captured by the Orcs. He's been put in chains and forced into doing manual labor to help the Orcs dig their tunnels. It is then that he realizes several other elves were likewise captured. He sees Maethor and then his leader, whose name I don't know because I don't actually think they said it in this episode, so let's call him Greg. So, first off, how are these elves captured? Arondir was captured specifically because he was lurking about in tunnels occupied by orcs. From what we know, these elves have already been in the process of leaving the valley by the end of the first episode. At the very least, you could have had a flashback scene showing how they got captured, or even maybe just a few brief throwaway lines between the elves. Furthermore, these aren't even tunnels anymore. They're just trenches with tarps overhead. I thought the orcs were building the tunnels to disguise their movement and protect them from the sunlight, and that's even what they say in this episode, but a trench does neither. If they thought it was sufficient to simply have tarps to cover them from the sun, then why don't they just create a road covered by tarps? All of this digging seems like a huge amount of wasted effort. And I do have to ask why these orcs captured these elves rather than simply killing them. It is true that Morgoth captured elves and enslaved them, but that was usually for very specific skilled labor, because elves are very useful, and he was powerful enough to keep them under his thumb. Sauron, however, didn't usually capture elves because he realized just how dangerous they would be to him even when captured. And it's even stranger that they allow them to group up and communicate with each other. Though, to be fair, how are the elves going to come up with an escape plan if they don't let them do that? Speaking of which, Greg tells his fellow elves to search for the nearest tree line whenever they get the chance to look over the side of the trench. One final question on this scene. Why do these orcs look nothing like the orcs from last episode? Their claws don't look the same, their faces don't look the same, their skin certainly doesn't look the same. Is it just because last episode it was CGI, whereas in this episode it's actual people in costumes? Are they different types of orcs? Well, maybe, I don't know. I guess I can't complain too much, as I was planning on tearing to shreds the orc design and behavior from the previous episode, whereas now it looks like they mostly fixed all my complaints, so maybe if we ever see the distorted mouth orcs again, I'll be able to do that. Alright, so unless they wanted to imply that Galadriel was having a dream about the slaves in the orcish camp, they absolutely should not have cut it like this. I suppose it's possible that that's what their intention was, given the urgency Galadriel suddenly has this episode. But if that's the case, I really feel like she should have had a brief line where Halbrand asks, "What's the rush?" and Galadriel responds, "I've seen the Southlands suffering." In actuality, it seems more likely that she's suddenly in a rush based on what Halbrand told her about orcs attacking his kingdom last episode. So we've got Elendil. I don't know, he's just a lot less cool than I was expecting him to be. He uses the term Eldar, and Galadriel calls herself a Noldo later this episode, so now I feel utterly justified in using those terms. Halbrand asks where we are going, and Elendil says, home. Is that supposed to mean something for them? Maybe Elendil mistook Halbrand for a Numenorian because at least he understands the physical impossibility of men being this far west at this point. So once again, I must reiterate my point from the last episode. The show looks nice, and the set design and cinematography for the entrance to Numenor are both pleasing to look at. I'm not attempting to imply from my criticism of any of the visual designs of the show that I had to look away in disgust because of how it melted my eyes. Well, except for one point, but we'll get to that later. The problem, however, is that as the audience viewing this, we aren't meant to be pleasantly enjoying the stroll. I think we're supposed to be awed by the majesty and enormity of Numenor in the way that people were when they saw Minas Tirith for the first time. For some reason, though, I simply didn't feel much here, and I don't think it's my overall dislike of the show. Return of the King out of the 3 Jackson movies annoys me the most each time I watch it, and yet the ascending score as Gandalf moves up the massive streets of the city gives me an impression of insurmountable grandeur each time I watch the scene. But I felt nothing here. I imagine that they simply didn't spend enough time on the actual journey the boat takes, and far too many shots were too zoomed out into bird's eye view in order for you to really get a sense of just how big it was. For instance, I actually like these 2 shots, and I think that if the opening scene were longer and had more of these, or was just simply composed of all of these, it would have made a much better impression. Galadriel mentions how elves used to come to Numenor, but they've been turned away. So wait, I knew that they were compressing the timeline, but I was still under the impression that everything was going to be happening in order. Instead, what seems to be happening is that they aren't just compressing the timeline, but rearranging it as well. The Eldar didn't stop coming to Numenor until the reign of Tar-Tanemir, who became king almost 500 years after the forging of the Rings of Power. The Numenorians had already been at war with Sauron, and they had been establishing permanent fortresses along the coastline at this point. Instead, what we just have is a copy of Numenor from the time of Ar-Pharazôn, where Elvish has been banished and the Eldar haven't been allowed for centuries, which has been teleported back in time almost 1500 years, possibly even more than that. Well, in any case, we have Galadriel seen with Tar Miriel, and that is not how I expected Miriel to be. No, not like that. I mean that she's acting very hostile to Galadriel, whereas she was one of the faithful and so should approach her with the same amount of respect that Elendil is showing. Besides this, the entire scene is annoying. Galadriel knows that the Numenorians are hostile, and yet she acts like a sharp-tongued child throwing a tantrum. Is her petulance really supposed to make her a more interesting character? Miriel is likewise insufferable with her smug face, but at the very least she's not being stupid. Galadriel knows that she's completely in their power, and since elves in this show have been radically debuffed, she knows she can't fight them without a weapon. What does she think is going to happen here?
My friends, it seems to me that our leaving presents some complications.
Alright, so I haven't been keeping a counter, but I actually think this is the third time that Halbrand has saved her life at this point, if only for his own sake rather than for any sense of charity. I'm actually annoyed at the fact that they're laughing at Galadriel here, since this is exactly the opposite of how Black Numenorians should be treating the elves. At the very least, there should be a hint of caution in their laughter. It's so fascinating watching someone who is meant to exude feminine grace and power being ridiculed as if she were a common criminal by people who should be terrified of her. Compare the mouth of Sauron's reaction when Aragorn merely stares at, no, not the Jackson one. Man, the series is making me riff on Jackson as well. Okay, let's just read the passage. After mocking Aragorn, who is significantly lower than an elf, and especially a high elf like Galadriel, this happens. Aragorn said naught in answer, but he took the other's eye and held it. And for a moment they strove thus, but soon, though Aragorn did not stir nor move hand to weapon, the other quailed and gave back as if menaced with a blow. I am a herald and ambassador, and I may not be assailed. Everyone here should be coward, or at least uneasy by the mere look in Galadriel's eyes. Instead, they're giggling because their chancellor made a funny comment. Anyway, Halbrand got Galadriel's knife back, so yay, she's still connected to Finrod, I guess. Great. I suppose this is going to be shipping material as well. Alright, then we've got the introduction of Isildur. He's on a boat and he seems to hear a call from something, but also knows a fair amount about how to work a ship, given that he realized what's about to happen here. Through some quick action, he and the others manage to defuse the situation and not have a man go overboard. And the captain tells them that there's no harsher master than the sea. Alright, fair enough. By the way, these ships don't have rudders, which makes me wonder how they're able to steer out in the open ocean. This design seems to be more along the lines of a galley, which is made for inland sea travel, like the Mediterranean or Black Seas.
The sea is always right!
I'm not even going to deal with that. So the orcs want the tree moved so that they can keep building their tunnel in the same direction, but Greg tells them they're going to have to change direction, and honestly, he's simply being the practical one here. You don't just have to cut down the tree, you have to remove its entire root system from your path if you want to go through it. It would save so much time and effort for everyone involved if they just moved around. Also, while we're on the topic, why are the orcs commanding other people to engage in the fun of ripping and tearing at big strong trees? I feel like they would be reserving that for themselves. They enjoy those sorts of activities. In any case, the orcs decide to give Greg a drink for his, passion. Great, we have Stormlight references now. Greg and the others suspect a trap, perhaps thinking it to be poison. So he drinks cautiously after the orc convinces him it's just water. Then, Greg gives the water to Arondir, who then gives it to Maethor. The orc then slashes Maethor's throat open while he stretches his neck to take a drink. Not sure why the orcs killed him when he wasn't even the one having the argument, or was it just meant to be cruel to Greg? I'm honestly confused as to why the orcs just don't kill all of these elves in the most slow, painful way they can. Well, in any case, Arondir volunteers to to cut down the tree, taking the opportunity to look over the edge. And now, I simply must ask, if the orcs are being this wanton in their destruction of this land, then the elves absolutely suck at scouting. How on earth did they not notice these trenches and massive desolation? Aren't elves supposed to have superhuman vision? Alright. So let's talk a little bit more about the Harfoots. I'm curious as to how these people can see without eye slits for their costumes, but let's ignore such a small issue. I'd like to talk to you all about wandering peoples. There are primarily 3 different types of wandering peoples. You have the nomadic or semi-nomadic people who are accustomed to seasonal or annual movement from one area to another as a means of following their grazing herds. In many of these groups, the movement is regular and even ritualized because it happens at predictable intervals. Another example is the traveling band, which moves in small groups from settled area to settled area and offers skilled work or assistance to people who live in those areas as a means of making a living. Finally, you have migratory people for whom living in one area is no longer possible, which could be due to a variety of factors such as war, famine, plague, etc. And so they move somewhere else in hopes of finding a living. The Harfoots match none of these, which I suppose isn't necessarily a problem, at least not in and of itself. You can have groups of people in a fantasy story which have no exact parallel in any other people group in the real world. The problem is that the principles behind these 3 types of wandering people, which allows them to function as a society, simply don't work with what we've been given about the Harfoots. So they do have a regular ritualized movement from one area to the next, similar to the nomadic groups. But unlike nomadic groups, they don't have any grazing animals which they're following. In fact, they don't even really seem to have any animals at all. Why? These carriages are clearly meant to be drawn by draft animals rather than people. Why don't they have ponies? If they can hide their entire dwelling places, then they can hide ponies. Also, unlike nomadic groups, they seem to be moving in a constant direction rather than in a relatively cyclical pattern. They obviously aren't traveling bands since they avoid any contact with others, even going so far as to make contact with the outsiders worthy of banishment. This means that they don't have a means of supporting themselves through trade or work. And finally, they aren't migratory in the sense that they don't settle in one location for several generations until it's impossible to live there anymore and then move to another one. They have such a regularized movement that it seems that everyone is familiar with the whole moving thing. And so they aren't actually migratory like, well, Harfoots. Tolkien seemed to be describing the Stores, Harfoots, and Fallowhides as a people who move over the course of several generations from one settled location to another. And in the appendices, we often see that the primary reason for the migration was the wars between the Dunedain and Nazgul. And so I have a question. Why are these people simply moving to some place on a regular basis? What's the point of regularly unsettling yourself from a location where you've begun to harvest food, just to move somewhere and start the process all over again? I suppose the idea is that they don't want to be discovered by staying in one place too long, or that they have an end goal in mind, but first off, this is silly as constantly moving about increases your chance of being seen by an order of magnitude. And where are they supposed to be going in the first place? How do they learn about it? Why are they going there? Worst of all is the notion of leaving members of your caravan behind. In actual wandering societies, they recognize that literally every single member of your company is a huge boon to survival, unless they're nothing more than a permanent drain on your resources. The idea that they would simply leave people behind because they're injured is so absurd that it's a wonder they haven't all died from lack of manpower. I'd almost be willing to forgive the writers for this if it were revealed that they were following some religion that preaches constant migration, or following some prophecy. Hell, maybe that's even what the book is for. But in actuality, it seems like they're setting this up as a survival tactic, and when your survival tactic makes it more likely for you all to die, then this becomes less acceptable as a story mechanic. Anyway, the only thing that actually happens in their story this episode is that Nori blackmails Poppy to help her get pages from the Elder's book to help Not Gandalf find those stars. Then, Not Gandalf tries to read them next to the fire, and I immediately knew what was going to happen. The pages burn, and Nori is outed as talking with an outsider, and so she's punished. Why is Not Gandalf stupid? Seriously, do I even need to explain why this is dumb? Or does no one else find it weird that they decided to portray Amaya as a child with mental deficiencies? That's not how amnesia works. So Muriel decided to make Captain Elendil the one in charge of watching over Galadriel. Okay, but why? I think this whole sequence encapsulates exactly why people don't like Galadriel. She's a self-righteous, arrogant brat who survives either by raw brute strength, luck, or someone else's intervention. And yet, I can't shake the feeling, most especially due to this Hallmark movie horseback ride. I mean, just look at this. What am I even watching here? This shot kills me each time I see it. Alright, I can't escape the feeling that we're actually supposed to like this thing. And just to be clear, no hate to the actor, it's just the character that she's playing is awful. And suddenly, from this moment on, it turns out she actually likes Numenor. What a child. And I'm sorry, is this supposed to be a romance movie or something? Why does Galadriel have to have romantic tension with Elendil? The writers have somehow managed to create possible ships for Galadriel with almost every other named male character she interacts with, except for Todd, because the writers hate him. It's too bad the Numenorians aren't able to do the same, so that we can just get this whole story over with at this point. You know, now that I think about it, it's almost as if there's a male-shaped hole in her life which is in desperate need of being filled. I wonder why that could be. As a side note, Halbrand has this whole side plot where he tries to get a job as a blacksmith, but the blacksmith tells him that he can't get hired unless he has the guild crest. So he decides to antagonize someone who has the guild crest and then lure him into a place of comfort so that he can steal it. I'm sorry, but what does he think this is actually going to do? Does he really think that having this coin will suddenly allow him to get a job? The show seems to portray this as a bad idea because he got caught, but honestly, it's just dumb in general. So the implication of this scene, especially when taking the prologue into account, is that the Numenorians have a more expansive library than the greatest lore masters among the Eldar. Why? Where did they get this knowledge? Which leads us to this scene.
This is no sigil. It is a map of the Southlands. It is as Halbrand said.
And the inscription?
It is the Black Speech. It speaks not only of a place, but a plan. A plan by which to create a realm of their own, where evil would not only endure, but thrive. A plan to be enacted in the event of Morgoth's defeat. By his successor.
Okay, so a few things. First off, I remember everyone saying that that's what this mark was meant to be, and while I saw the plausible connection on the map, I was hesitant to accept it because it just seems so stupid. Even for this show, for Sauron to be branding his enemies with his planned setup location. Why would he do that? But now that it's not only been confirmed, but more about this plan has been revealed, I'm once again baffled by this. You're telling me that Morgoth, the biggest, baddest fallen angel in the Legendarium, who planned on taking over the entire world and ruling everything forever, allowed his servants to come up with contingency plans in case he died? First off, I'm not even sure it was in the mental capability of Morgoth's servants to conceive of the notion that he would fall. Sauron was reportedly so distraught at the realization that Morgoth had lost that he might have actually repented at the sight of it. And I'm not even sure the orcs would have had the foresight to imagine the situation. It would be like telling a Christian that we need to prepare for when God, as the eternal, immovable, all-powerful creator, dies, and we need to decide who to choose as his successor. However, even ignoring the psychological impossibility for the servants of Morgoth to conceive of this plan, what's even more bizarre is the fact that it managed to be formulated during Morgoth's reign at all. You're telling me Morgoth wouldn't have executed the first person to have even suggested this idea? That he wouldn't have hunted down anyone who was caught with a what-to-do list for when he died? How would that not have been considered blasphemy of the highest order? How did anyone even start that conversation? Next, we have the family dinner scene, and so apparently Elendil isn't actually one of the faithful, or at least he's been gradually abandoning them, or maybe appearing to abandon them. And that's why he says the now infamous,
"The past is dead. We either move forward or we die with it."
Then he starts yelling at his children, only to do a 180 when this chick says that she's been accepted into the Builders Guild. Then Isildur runs off, and I have no idea how I'm even supposed to be interpreting this scene or what I'm supposed to be getting out of it. So let's just move on.
Many ages ago, a man bearing that mark united the scattered tribes of the Southlands under one banner. The very banner that might unite them again today, against the evil that now seeks to claim their lands. Your lands, Halbrand. Your people have no king, for you are him.
Oh my gosh. They're actually doing it. We're getting Jackson's Aragorn again. Oh no. Oh. Look, if you're going to have an Aragorn character, at least make him the one from the books. Alright, so Halbrand, especially in this episode, has been shown to be a callous, cruel, manipulative thief, and now Galadriel just seems to be manipulating Halbrand to get him to help her kill Sauron, which would be good were it not for the fact that Galadriel's only motivation here is revenge, or, to be fair, maybe she wants to save the Southlanders as well. I suppose they're really doubling down on the vindictive, stubborn, manipulative Galadriel, who would have more place as a villain than as a protagonist at this point. So, yeah, this ship is my vote. Also, Halbrand says that his ancestors swore a blood oath to Morgoth. And I don't know how many more times I'm going to have to bring this up, but again, this makes no sense. Why do they make it seem like Morgoth lived in Mordor or something like that? It seems we have to have at least one utterly absurd sequence per episode. Alright, so let's lay out what's going on here. The Orcs have captured a group of Elves who are now planning on how to escape. The plan is, now that Arondir has spotted the nearest tree line, to use the fact that the Orcs are so pale that their skin literally burns the moment they touch sunlight to strike back against the Orcs when the sun is at its brightest. For the purposes of this scene, let's ignore the fact that Orcs shouldn't actually be allergic to the sun. Let's just give the show that as part of its setup. The Elves begin their assault by using chains to knock out a few of the Orcs, and so enter into a tug of war over the chains until Arondir, whose chains for some reason apparently aren't being pulled, jumps on the top of the chains to destroy the beams upholding the tarps and lets in the sun. The Orcs then retreat because they're allergic to the sun, remember? This Orc then says, "Release the warg," like this is Clash of the Titans, and then they get out of the way only for this to happen. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, I could not stop laughing when this little puppy hobbled onto the screen. This thing is so hideous, but like not in an orcish way or even a gory way. It's more in an uncanny valley way. I mean, this looks like a CG replication of a 5-year-old's attempt at drawing a dog or some bizarre Sonic rendering. Anyway, we have this chick who grabs a spear, but seems to be more concerned with spinning it than defending herself, and so she gets her chest torn out of her. So anyway, Arondir dodges the warg bite, which causes the warg to fly through the tree roots, which perfectly imprisons it. Not sure why it didn't come out the way it came in, but oh well. The Orcs then decide that they don't mind getting burnt by the sun and grab onto Arondir's chains as he's tying up the warg. They yank him, and then Arondir grabs a branch from the tree and stabs an Orc in the neck with it. Alright, so Greg then attempts to escape after breaking his chains, and Arondir goes to check on him and finds that he gets shot, presumably by these three. I'm guessing that these are Uruks or men, because otherwise I would have to ask what on earth they're doing out in the sun. Ismail does not maintain his acting face for this scene, finally. Then Arondir gets pulled to the ground and is about to be killed before someone says that he should be taken to Adar. The last shot is then a blurry image of someone. So again, the fact that a band of orcs have at least 5 elves all working in the same place is absolutely insane. You might think, oh, well, they're doing that because they have them under wraps. Well, first off, no they don't. It's mostly that the elves had an awful plan, but these elves honestly could have come up with a very successful way to escape. Which reminds me, why are they doing this in one telegraphed escape attempt? Anyway, more importantly, the orcs wouldn't know if they had them safely under their thumb. I cannot stress just how dangerous elves should be to orcs. The mere stare of a sylvan elf should be enough to cower several of them until they have overwhelming numbers, and Sauron simply isn't high enough above them like Morgoth to keep them as slaves. They should have all been executed by the time they even made it to the trench. Second, are orcs allergic to the sun or not? We see them wince when entering sunlight even with their head coverings, and yet they all charge out at once here and we don't see their arms steaming or anything. But more importantly, what did they do to this warg? Why do the CGI enemies in this show look so incompetently arranged? This whole sequence displays a general problem I have with all the action sequences in the show so far. There's a lack of coherency with what's going on and where, as well as a weightlessness to the action, not to mention absolute absurdities. I could not stop laughing when I saw Arondir grab a twig and use it to stab an orc. I was howling at that moment. And that's the end of the analysis. I know that probably seems abrupt, but there isn't really much I can do beyond simply pointing out the same general stuff I did last week. There's a general neglect of the lore, but not in a sort of we're going entirely in a different direction way, but rather a you need to understand the Silmarillion in order to appreciate or understand what's going on in the show, but we're also just going to mess up everything from the Silmarillion, or the appendices for that matter. I really hope next week is a change of pace because these episodes are becoming progressively more boring for me. With episode 1, I at least felt like stuff was constantly happening, and so it ended up being more frustrating and approaching entertainingly bad rather than boring. Episode 2 was so samey in terms of environment and unengaging in terms of plot and character progression that it almost made me fall asleep the first time. This, well, I'll admit I had fewer things which enraged me after watching it compared to the previous 2 episodes, but that's just because it felt like nothing happened here. We are 3 episodes in and I still don't actually know what the plot of the story is going to be other than something along the lines of the rings of power are going to be forged. Galadriel's character continues to be an insufferable, petulant child who throws temper tantrums when contradicted and then switches to jovial when given a single pleasure ride. Furthermore, they've so removed any sense of grace or dignity from her that at this point you have common Numenorians laughing at Pharazôn's sarcastic remarks. This is actually a general problem with the elves in this show. They're simply humans. They're not particularly more strong, beautiful, clever, agile, or wise than humans. They just have pointy ears and, I guess, are probably immortal. Now, I don't know if the intention of making Galadriel into a warrior was for the purpose of making her more interesting or making her into more of a feminist icon, though my suspicion is that it's the former rather than the latter. But in either case, they failed. It might be that I'm alone in this point, but I don't think giving a character flaws makes them interesting or relatable. How interesting a character is has more to do with how well-rounded and fleshed out they are and how coherent all their different character traits are in and of themselves, how they interact with each other, and how those attributes add to the story being told. I will admit, I actually really enjoy seeing what Numenor is like when the faithful have become marginalized. This scene with Galadriel and Elendil was actually the highlight of the episode for me, and I enjoyed listening to them talk to each other in Elvish, even for only a brief moment. And it makes sense, given the context, that this would be the first thing that softens her attitude towards him. Tolkien was fairly sparse in terms of his comments on just what it was like for the faithful Numenorians to live under the later kings, especially after they abandoned Elvish names, so it's honestly nice to see this fleshed out a little more. However, even this section of the story isn't without its problems. Promoting Elendil in this context doesn't really make sense. Surely Miriel, who should be neither Queen Regent nor a Black Numenorian, no, not like that. She should at least know that letting someone like Elendil have custody over the elf is just going to allow Galadriel to get what she wants. Miriel should be one of the faithful, but if she's not going to be, then you should at the very least portray how she should be acting accurately. No Elrond, Bronwyn, Gil-galad, or dwarves in this episode, which I actually kind of found weird, but I suppose it was for the best, as I'm not exactly sure how much more of that I could take. Overall, I'd rate this episode to be about a 4 out of 10 compared to episodes 1 and 2, which are sitting handily at 2 to 3 out of 10. Now, given how almost everything I've said has been negative, that might be a little bit surprising, but that's just because as far as I see it, anything below a 7 out of 10 is a failure. The only thing which one can assess at that point is just how much of a failure it is. And what can I say? This was more boring, but it just wasn't as absurd as the previous 2 episodes. Nothing will ever redeem the fact that Galadriel tried to swim the ocean. Well, I suppose that's all there really is to talk about for this episode. I decided to pass over a few minor complaints like how Halbrand got this money in the first place, or the fact that they got Elendil's name translation technically wrong. Unfortunately, not that much really happened, though maybe that's actually a good thing considering how what did happen wasn't really that great either. Well, as I'm sure you guys have been able to hear from the sound of my voice, I'm getting bored. So I think I'll just go reread Unfinished Tales in preparation for the next episode. See you then.